Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, calm, and mildly existential. So if you're settling in, dimming the lights, and trying to pretend tomorrow's responsibilities don't exist, you're in the right place. Because tonight, we're gliding through one of the most oddly soothing topics imaginable. What happened to every U.S. president after they left the White House? That's right, every chief executive, kicked out of the world's loudest workplace, suddenly forced to figure out what normal people do from 9 to 5. It turns out, many of them didn't handle retirement well. Some drifted into quiet farm life. Some tried to come back to power like it was a clearance sale. Some wrote extremely long memoirs that no one at the time wanted to read. And some, well, they basically retired to be professional sulkers. A few didn't even make it long enough to unpack their luggage. So, let's slide right in. Calm voice, slow rhythm, and float back to the very beginning. George Washington, left office 1797. Let's start with the man himself, George Washington, the guy who looked constantly done with everyone's nonsense. He left the presidency after 2 terms, which shocked people at the time, because Americans assumed he'd just be president until he died. But Washington, who was basically allergic to drama, said, "No thanks, I'm going home now," and meant it. After stepping down, he went back to Mount Vernon, where he tried very hard to live a peaceful farm life. And by peaceful, I mean he spent a lot of time supervising, because he absolutely loved supervising things. Crops, livestock, workers, guests, everything. He supervised like it was a competitive sport. Washington also spent his retirement politely turning down requests to run things. People kept writing to him like, "General Washington, could you maybe lead the army again?" Or, "Hey, we're thinking of forming a political party. Want to be its mascot?" And Washington, in the most presidential form of ghosting ever recorded, usually answered months later with a letter that basically said, "No. Also, I'm very tired." He tried to stay out of politics, but politics didn't stay out of him. People argued about him constantly. Newspapers said he was secretly a monarchist. Others said he was the last hope of the republic. He was the internet celebrity of the 1990s, without the internet. He spent a lot of time worrying about his estate, money, and awkwardly that he owned hundreds of enslaved people. He began writing complicated plans for how to set many of them free in his will, because Washington, in retirement, apparently loved paperwork even more than he loved supervising. He didn't get many peaceful years. In 1799, after riding his horse around in freezing wet weather, because of course he did that, he got sick and died fairly quickly. Even on his deathbed, he was supervising, telling people exactly what to do and when. Classic George. John Adams, left office 1801. Next, we glide to a man who was basically an all-caps email in human form. John Adams. Adams left office extremely annoyed, mostly because Thomas Jefferson beat him in the election, and Adams hated losing the way most people hate stepping on Legos in the dark. After leaving the White House, he didn't even wait for sunrise. He literally left Washington at 4 a.m. He didn't tell anyone goodbye. He didn't stay for Jefferson's inauguration. He slipped away like a Victorian man avoiding emotional conversations. Adams returned to Quincy, Massachusetts, and entered what historians politely call his retirement. What he actually did was sit down and write letters. Thousands of letters. He wrote like he was paid per word. He wrote to friends, enemies, his wife Abigail, and eventually to Thomas Jefferson, because those two loved to fight, but they loved to write even more. Adams spent his retirement rereading philosophy, farming, and wondering why people didn't appreciate him more. He would occasionally complain about being forgotten, which is a very Adams thing to complain about. But his old rivalry with Jefferson softened into a very long, very intellectual, very old man pen pal friendship. They wrote each other about politics, religion, aging, and how weird the world was becoming. It was like two retired professors sending emails at 2 a.m. And then, in one of the most dramatic, yet somehow still sleepy coincidences in American history, Adams died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, just hours after Thomas Jefferson. His last words were supposedly, "Thomas Jefferson still lives," which he didn't, but it's the thought that counts. Thomas Jefferson, left office 1809. Jefferson left office ready for the quiet life at Monticello, which was his extremely aesthetic, extremely expensive mountaintop mansion. He spent the next years doing what Jefferson did best: reading, writing, gardening, inventing gadgets, and being deeply in debt and pretending he wasn't. Jefferson had a very gentle retirement influencer vibe. He designed skylights, he arranged his books by subject, he replanted trees. He received a constant stream of guests who wanted to meet the author of the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson, being Jefferson, fed them wine he couldn't afford, and then wrote letters afterwards complaining that people kept visiting. He also founded the University of Virginia, which became his favorite child. He obsessed over every brick, every column, every curriculum detail. It was his retirement project, but on a ridiculous scale, like if someone decided to relax by building an entire college campus from scratch. Jefferson and Adams kept writing their long letters, providing historians with some of the best old man commentary in American history. And, like Adams, he died on July 4th, 1826. This time on purpose. Well, not intentionally, but the timing was dramatic enough that if he'd been conscious, Jefferson would have absolutely approved.
James Madison, left office 1817. Madison, the smallest president and arguably the calmest, went home to Montpelier after leaving office. His retirement was extremely Madison-like, quiet, thoughtful, and full of long debates about things that no one had energy to debate with him anymore. Madison spent a lot of time editing the records of the Constitutional Convention, because he was the kind of person who rewrote his notes decades later for accuracy. He basically spent his retirement trying to make sure everyone understood that he had, in fact, been very smart in the 1780s. He also became the first really long-lived founding father. People visited him constantly. Young politicians came to seek advice. He served on boards, wrote letters, answered questions, and occasionally wandered around his estate looking like a polite but exhausted grandfather of the nation. His financial situation wasn't great. Plantations were expensive, labor was cruelly exploited, and Madison ended up struggling with debt in his later years. Still, he stayed intellectually sharp until the end, which is honestly on brand for a man whose idea of fun was reading political theory. Madison died in 1836, quietly, at home, probably the most peaceful exit of the early presidents. James Monroe, left office 1825. Monroe, of Monroe Doctrine fame, had a retirement that was significantly less glamorous than his presidency. After leaving office, he discovered he was, unfortunately, broke. Not tight budget broke. Full-on, please don't send me any more bills, I can't pay them, broke. He bounced between family homes, spending time with his daughters, and writing long appeals to Congress asking for reimbursement for expenses he'd covered during his decades of government service. Which, to be fair, was a lot. Monroe basically lived on the road for years doing early American diplomacy, and the government kinda forgot to pay him back. His wife's, Elizabeth's, health declined, and Monroe focused on caring for her until she died in 1830. After that, Monroe moved in with his daughter in New York City, where he lived a very quiet, melancholy life reading newspapers and complaining about politicians. He died in 1831, also on July 4th, because apparently early presidents liked to coordinate for symbolic effect. James Quincy Adams, left office 1829. Now we drift to one of the most intense overachievers of the 19th century, John Quincy Adams. He is what happens when a gifted kid grows up and refuses to stop taking honors classes. When he lost re-election to Andrew Jackson, did he retire? Of course not. John Quincy Adams would never do something that normal. Instead, he ran for Congress and won. He became the only former president to return to the House of Representatives, where he served for almost 17 years. His post-presidency was basically a second political career, one that was far more dramatic, outspoken, and effective than his time in the White House. He fought against slavery, battled with political rivals, lectured the nation about morality, and delivered passionate speeches that definitely did not fit the sleepy energy we are currently trying to exude. He also took up swimming in the Potomac River every morning, sometimes completely naked. This was not a metaphor, this was just John Quincy Adams being John Quincy Adams. He famously collapsed at his desk in the House chamber in 1848. He was carried to a nearby room, placed on a couch, and passed away calmly 2 days later, exactly as the most dramatically intense former president would. Andrew Jackson, left office 1837. And now we float over to Andrew Jackson, a man made entirely of anger, grit, and questionable medical decisions. Jackson retired to the Hermitage in Tennessee, where he attempted to relax, despite not being a relaxing kind of person. He was in terrible health from decades of battles, duels, bullets lodged in his body, and ignoring doctors. Yet he still managed to write thousands of letters, give political advice, feud with people, and endorse candidates. His retirement was basically presidency but without the office. He loudly supported Martin Van Buren, complained when Van Buren lost, pushed for annexing Texas, and held court at his home like a retired king who still expected everyone to listen to him. Visitors described him as frail but fiery, an old warrior running on stubbornness alone. He lived surrounded by family, flowers, and people asking him for political endorsements. He finally died in 1845 after years of chronic illness and probably after exhausting every doctor within 20 miles of the radius.
Van Buren to Buchanan, the pre-Civil War drift. Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in a little deeper, loosen your shoulders. Maybe pretend you're listening from a rocking chair on a quiet porch. Tonight, we're still drifting along the strange, sometimes lonely roads that U.S. presidents wandered after leaving the White House. We're now entering the era of fancy sideburns, fragile political parties, and people writing extremely long memoirs that, let's be honest, most of their neighbors probably never read. So let's float gently to our next retired commander-in-chief. Martin Van Buren, left office 1841. Martin Van Buren always looked slightly amused, as if he'd just overheard someone mispronounce an important Dutch word. After leaving office, thanks to the Panic of 1837, which absolutely tanked the economy, Van Buren retired to his estate, Lindenwold, in Kinderhook, New York. His retirement started quietly. He rode horses, he walked the grounds, he collected books he didn't always finish reading. It was all very pastoral and calm. But the thing about Van Buren is he never truly retired. He tried again for the presidency, and again, and then again. In 1844, he tried for the Democratic nomination, but his wishy-washy stance on Texas annoyed everyone. In 1848, because why not double down, he ran as the Free Soil Party candidate, mainly because he enjoyed watching his old party squirm. He lost spectacularly, but he had a great time doing it. His later years were peaceful. He received visitors, wrote letters, and occasionally gave political advice no one asked for. He died in 1862, quietly, as the Civil War raged around the country he once led. William Henry Harrison left office after 32 days, 1841. Harrison didn't exactly have a post-presidency. He barely had a presidency. After giving a famously long inauguration speech in the freezing cold without a coat because he wanted to look tough, he got sick and died 1 month later. So, in terms of retirement, imagine packing for a job and then immediately packing again, permanently. That's about the extent of it. John Tyler left office 1845. Now we drift to a man whose life after the White House was complicated. Tyler left office misunderstood, disliked, and barely considered a legitimate president by half the country. He went home to Sherwood Forest, his Virginia plantation, and tried to live peacefully, surrounded by an extremely large family. He eventually had 15 children total, because John Tyler apparently had boundless energy in exactly one department. Tyler enjoyed hosting parties, debating politics, and tending to his property. He also remarried in office, his wife Julia being 30 years younger, which definitely kept him busy. But his story takes a sharp turn. As tensions rose before the Civil War, Tyler openly sided with the Confederacy. He even won election to the Confederate Congress, though he died before he could take his seat. Because of this, the U.S. government didn't honor him with the usual presidential funeral. He is the only former American president buried under a foreign flag, the Confederate one. A weird and sad footnote, drifting far from the peaceful retirements earlier presidents enjoyed. James K. Polk left office 1849. Polk retired for the shortest period of any president who lived past office, about 3 months. He left the White House exhausted, absolutely drained. Polk was a micromanager, a workaholic, and someone who treated every goal like a personal grudge match. When he finally went home, he and his wife Sarah moved into a new home in Nashville. They unpacked, redecorated, and attempted to relax. But Polk, whose immune system had been weakened by stress, likely caught cholera shortly after leaving office. He died that same summer. His retirement was basically the amount of time it takes to binge a Netflix show. Zachary Taylor left office because he died, 1850. Like Harrison, Zachary Taylor didn't get a retirement either. He died suddenly while still in office, rumored to have been from bad cherries and milk, though more likely from heat and severe stomach illness. No post-presidency, just an abrupt exit, leaving the country confused and his successor scrambling for a plan.
Millard Fillmore left office 1853. Millard Fillmore, a man who always looked like a moderately irritated librarian, returned to Buffalo, New York after his presidency. Fillmore had a quiet retirement with occasional bursts of please notice me energy. He remarried a much younger woman, Caroline McIntosh, who was wealthy and had strong opinions about social decorum. So suddenly, Fillmore went from middle-class lawyer to wealthy gentleman who hosted nice dinners and joined fancy clubs. He busied himself with leading charities, running civic organizations, and politely making political statements no one considered influential. But Fillmore did manage one controversial move. During the Civil War, he supported the Union, but also blamed abolitionists for causing the conflict. So his legacy became muddled. Not terrible, not glorious, just politely confusing. He lived a long, calm retirement and died in 1874, remembered mainly for having a funny name and being the answer to trivia questions. Franklin Pierce, left office 1857. Now we drift to the saddest cloud in the pre-war sky, Franklin Pierce. His life before the presidency was tragic, and his retirement continued the theme. Pierce left office deeply unpopular. His pro-Southern views upset most Northerners, and his own party refused to renominate him, always a good sign. He returned home to New Hampshire, where tragedy followed. His wife Jane, who struggled with depression, withdrew even more. Pierce himself turned increasingly to alcohol, so much so that historians gently describe him as a heavy drinker, which is historian speak for this man lived inside a whiskey barrel. He traveled through Europe, trying to distract himself, but he never regained political relevance. During the Civil War, he publicly criticized Lincoln, because apparently Pierce liked to pick fights with people far more popular than he was. When Lincoln was assassinated, Pierce was the only former president not invited to the funeral. He died in 1869, lonely, mostly ignored, and remembered as one of the most ineffective presidents in the nation's history. A very soft, slow fade-out. James Buchanan, left office 1861. And here we glide into the man who handed Abraham Lincoln the country in a state of absolute meltdown. James Buchanan left office with the reputation of worst president so far, and historians have not exactly warmed up to him since. His retirement was awkward, painfully awkward. He went home to Wheatland, his Pennsylvania estate, and immediately set to work doing what any man with a crushed reputation would do. He wrote a book explaining why nothing was his fault. His memoir, Mr. Buchanan's Administration, was essentially a 300-page defensive rant. He insisted he had handled things fine, and that everyone else, from Congress to the Supreme Court to probably the neighborhood cat, was responsible for the Civil War. People were not convinced. Buchanan lived quietly, receiving few guests, feeling very sorry for himself, and occasionally giving unhelpful political commentary. When news from the war was bad, he sighed dramatically and blamed everyone except James Buchanan. To his credit, he did support the Union once the war began, but his reputation never recovered. He died in 1868, still convinced history would vindicate him. History did not.
Hey guys, welcome back. Settle into the quiet. Let your breathing slow down a little. Maybe let the pillow win for once. Tonight we continue gliding through the strangely soft, occasionally tragic afterlives of America's presidents. This time moving through the Civil War era and into the Gilded Age, when facial hair got bigger, politics got messier, and retirement plans got increasingly improvised. Some left office as heroes, some left in scandal, some barely had time to leave at all. But every one of them drifted into a different kind of after. So let's float gently to the next one. Abraham Lincoln, left office by assassination, 1865. Lincoln's presidency ended abruptly. We all know that. He was taken from the country at the exact moment he began imagining a peaceful future. So, like Harrison and Taylor before him, Lincoln never had a retirement. No quiet walks in Springfield, no books, no porch sitting. Just an empty space where the next decades of his life should have been. Mary Todd Lincoln, however, did have a long post-White House life, filled with debt, mental health struggles, and frequent moves. But Lincoln himself didn't get a coda, just a nation grieving and guessing at who he might have become. So, we drift forward. Andrew Johnson, left office 1869. Andrew Johnson left office disliked by Republicans, distrusted by Democrats, and held together mostly by stubbornness and questionable speeches. After leaving Washington, Johnson returned to Tennessee, where he immediately began running for office again because he absolutely refused to take a hint. He ran for the Senate, lost, ran for the House, lost, ran for the Senate again, lost again. Did he stop? Of course not. This was Andrew Johnson. His hobbies included arguing with everyone and trying to resurrect his political career. But eventually, in 1875, 6 years after leaving the presidency, he actually won his Senate seat back. He became the first former president to return to the Senate. He showed up, delivered a few speeches reminding everyone he was still, in fact, Andrew Johnson, and then died that same year. Not a peaceful retirement, more like an extended argument with the state of Tennessee. Ulysses S. Grant. Left office 1877. Now we drift into one of the more surprisingly wholesome post-presidencies. Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero, quiet man, terrible president when it came to picking honest friends, left office ready for something different. So he and his wife, Julia, did the most unexpectedly charming thing possible. They took a 2.5-year world tour. The Grants traveled everywhere. They met Queen Victoria, Japanese emperors, European monarchs, famous writers. Everywhere they went, people cheered. Grant, who had spent much of his life feeling awkward in crowds, suddenly became an international celebrity. When he got home, he briefly considered running for a third term because being adored globally can do that to you. But Congress said no thanks, and the country politely looked away. Grant then made the classic post-retirement mistake. He invested all of his money in a business run by a man who should have had "Do not trust me" stamped on his forehead. The company collapsed. Grant lost everything. He was broke, humiliated, and sick with throat cancer. So he did the only thing left. He wrote his memoirs, and they are still considered some of the best ever written by an American president. Calm, reflective, quietly powerful. Very on brand for Grant. He finished the manuscript days before he died in 1885. It earned enough money to support his family and restore their financial stability. A sad but dignified ending for a man who never asked for glory, but somehow always found it anyway. Rutherford Hayes. Left office 1881. Rutherford Hayes, the man with the most polite beard in U.S. history, enjoyed one of the most relaxed retirements on this list. After leaving office, he went home to Spiegel Grove in Ohio, where he lived like a gentle, slightly bored grandfather of the nation. He spent his days reading, writing letters, talking about education, taking careful walks, and making speeches he hoped would help people behave better. Hayes had promised to serve only one term, and to his credit, he kept that promise happily. He supported prison reform, African American education, and public libraries, basically the presidential soft life. He traveled a little, hosted guests, talked endlessly about morality. He was the human equivalent of a polite lecture. Hayes died peacefully in 1893, surrounded by family and books, leaving behind the vibe of a man who tried very hard to make the world a little less chaotic.
James A. Garfield, left office by assassination, 1881. Garfield barely had a presidency, and his post-presidency was, tragically, the weeks he spent dying from infection after being shot. He lingered for 80 days. Doctors poking around with unwashed hands didn't help, and the country drifted through a long, sad vigil. No retirement, just an unfinished life and enormous bearded potential. Chester A. Arthur, left office
1885. Chester A. Arthur always looked like a man who took great pride in his side whiskers, and he did. He also left office with a secret. He was dying of Bright's disease, a kidney condition he'd hidden from the public. When Arthur left office in 1885, he returned to New York City trying to look dignified and upbeat. He rented rooms, visited clubs, tried to enjoy fancy dinners, but his energy was fading fast. Unlike other presidents, Arthur didn't write memoirs or give many speeches. He avoided politics almost completely, partly because he was exhausted, partly because the Republican Party had moved on without him. He destroyed most of his personal papers in his final months, which is both mysterious and very on brand. The man loved a good aesthetic, and apparently that included a very chic exit. Arthur died quietly in 1886, leaving behind immaculate facial hair and a reputation historians still debate. Grover Cleveland, first retirement, 1889-1893. This is his first one, the 1889 to 1893 era, his chill intermission. After losing re-election to Benjamin Harrison, Cleveland and his much younger wife Frances moved to New York City. There, Cleveland practiced law, complained about newspapers, and enjoyed being a new father. Frances, meanwhile, became a public favorite, charming, fashionable, and absolutely adored. Cleveland used his retirement to pretend he didn't want the presidency back, but of course he did. The man had a whole second term brewing inside him. His calm retirement didn't last long because the political winds shifted dramatically, and Cleveland, who was as subtle as a foghorn, rode right back into office 4 years later. We'll cover his actual retirement in Part 4, which was much longer and much weirder. Benjamin Harrison, left office 1893. Benjamin Harrison left the White House after losing to Cleveland, the first time a president lost to the same rival who had lost to him. Harrison's retirement had a slightly melancholy air. His wife, Carolyn, died during his presidency, and Harrison spent his first years out of office trying to rebuild a quieter life. He returned to Indianapolis, practiced law, and wrote long, carefully organized essays on the Constitution. He also gave lectures so calm and monotone that even historians describe them as measured, which is historian code for please do not operate heavy machinery while listening. Then, Harrison surprised everyone by remarrying. His new wife, Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, was 27 years younger and his late wife's niece, which was a family drama no one was emotionally prepared for. He had a daughter late in life and seemed quite happy in his final years, hosting dinners, writing, and enjoying domestic calm. Harrison died in 1901 from pneumonia, leaving behind a legacy somewhere between underrated and polite footnote. Grover Cleveland, second retirement, 1897. Now we glide back to Cleveland, who left office for the second and final time in 1897, very ready to never see Washington again. He and Frances moved to Princeton, New Jersey, where Cleveland became the world's crankiest retiree. He lectured people about politics. He lectured them about economics. He lectured college students about responsibility. He lectured newspapers for existing. And yet he was still somehow charming about it. Cleveland spent his retirement fishing constantly, smoking cigars, writing articles complaining about literally everything, giving unwanted political advice, and proudly avoiding exercise. He also became a trustee at Princeton University, where he tried to make moral speeches to students who probably just wanted to get to dinner. Cleveland died in 1908. His last words were supposedly, "I have tried so hard to do right," which is exactly what a man who loved lecturing people would say.
The night it followed me home. The night air felt heavier than usual, as if something unseen was pressing down on the entire neighborhood. I tried to convince myself it was stress, or maybe just the cold. But the moment I stepped inside my house, I realized the feeling hadn't stayed outside. It had followed me in.
The hallway lights flickered, just once, like a camera flash. I froze. My house was silent. Too silent. Even the usual ticking of the clock felt muted, as if sound itself didn't want to exist right now. I locked the door behind me, but the lock clicked in a strange, slow echo, almost like the sound was being stretched. I whispered to myself, "It's nothing, just tired." But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Then it started. A soft shuffle. Not loud, not threatening, but unmistakably real. It came from my living room. I tiptoed forward, heart pounding, trying not to make a sound. The room was dark, except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside. For a moment, everything looked normal. The couch was where it always was, the table untouched, no windows open, no shadows out of place. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, behind the curtain, a shape shifted ever so slightly, like someone was standing perfectly still, but breathing slowly. I didn't move. It didn't move. We were both waiting. Then, from behind the curtain, something whispered. Not a voice, not words, just a breath. A long, cold exhale. I stepped back, slowly, my hands shaking. Then something incredible happened. The curtain swayed, but not from the wind. There was no wind. It moved as if an invisible hand was brushing against it, like someone was testing whether I could see them. I couldn't run, I couldn't speak, but I managed to take one shaky breath, and suddenly everything stopped. The curtain stilled, the whispering breath faded, the house became silent again. I stood there for nearly a minute, waiting, listening. Then I turned away. I shouldn't have, because behind me, soft, steady footsteps began following. One step, pause, another step, pause, as if whatever was behind the curtain had decided it wasn't hiding anymore. The footsteps that weren't mine. The footsteps behind me weren't loud. They weren't fast, but each one felt deliberate, like it was matching the rhythm of my fear. I didn't turn around, not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me whispered not to. I walked toward my bedroom slowly, pretending I didn't hear anything. Maybe if I acted calm, maybe if I pretended nothing was there. But the footsteps followed, always a few seconds apart, never rushing, never stopping. As if whatever was following me didn't need to hurry, as if it knew I wasn't going anywhere. I reached my room and flicked on the light. The moment the switch clicked, the footsteps stopped behind me. Silence filled the hallway, heavy and thick. For the first time since I got home, I felt brave enough to turn around. Nothing. Just the empty corridor. But something was off. The shadows were wrong. Not darker, just shaped differently, as if the hallway had one shadow too many. I swallowed hard and stepped back into my room, shutting the door gently, not slamming it, not locking it, in case I needed to run. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. My bedroom window, which I always keep closed at night, was open. Just slightly. Enough for a thin line of cold air to slip in. Enough for the curtain to move in a slow, unnatural sway. I approached it carefully. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing disturbed. But the cold coming through the gap felt different, like it wasn't outside air, but something breathing in. I shut the window firmly. The moment it clicked closed, a soft tap sounded on the other side. Just one, like a finger gently knocking right where my hand had been. Every muscle in my body tensed. Then, from behind me, inside the room, the footsteps started again. Slow, calm, steady. But this time, they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from the corner of my room. The one place I hadn't checked. I turned my head slowly, so slowly I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The corner was dark, too dark, like the shadows were pooling there. Then something shifted inside the darkness. Not stepping out, not attacking, just tilting its head, watching me, almost curious. The room felt colder, the air heavier. And then, from that corner, a voice whispered. Not loud, not angry, just soft, like someone leaning close to tell a secret. You shouldn't have closed the window.
The corner that breathed. I didn't answer the whisper. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The corner of my room remained still, a darker patch of darkness, watching me with a patience that didn't feel human. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. I took one slow step back, not enough to provoke anything, just enough so I could reach the light switch without turning my back. The figure didn't react. It just stayed there, head slightly tilted, like it was studying how I planned to survive the next few seconds. My fingers brushed the switch. Before I could flip it, the shadow in the corner straightened. Not stepping forward, not advancing, just rising to its full height. A height that was wrong. Too tall, too stretched, as if someone had drawn a person from memory and got the proportions slightly off. My hand froze on the switch. I whispered, barely audible, "Who are you?" The shadow didn't answer. Instead, the room shifted, not physically, but the feeling in it changed. The air wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, almost like someone had opened an oven door behind me. And then came the sound. Not footsteps this time, not whispering. Breathing. Slow, steady, but not coming from the corner. It was coming from right beside me, like someone was standing close enough to lean against my shoulder, even though nothing was touching me. I couldn't bring myself to look.
The shadow in the corner remained still, which only made it worse because something else was clearly near me. I forced myself to turn my head slightly. Nothing there. But the breathing continued, calm, measured, as if whoever or whatever it was had all the time in the world to let me notice it. Then the shadow in the corner finally moved, not toward me, but upward. It rose slowly, impossibly, sliding up the wall like smoke pulled by an invisible hand, softly, quietly, until it reached the ceiling and spread across it in a thin layer of darkness, almost like it was settling in. The warm breath beside me stopped, and in the silence that followed, something else happened. My phone lit up on the nightstand. A notification. No one was texting me, no calls, just a single line glowing on the screen. Do not look up. The message wasn't from any app. No sender. Just the words. I stayed perfectly still. The room was silent, but I could feel the ceiling watching me, waiting. Then, slowly, as if 1,000 tiny fingers were dragging across the plaster, I heard a faint, shifting sound above me. A soft, scraping slide. And then a whisper from directly overhead. Good. You listened. The ceiling that listened back. I kept my eyes locked on the wall in front of me. Not the ceiling, not the corner, just one harmless patch of paint, pretending I wasn't trapped in a room with something that definitely wasn't paying rent. The whisper above me faded into the quiet. Not gone, just waiting. I could feel that. The air was warm again. Not comforting warm, though. More like the kind of heat you feel when someone leans too close behind you. A presence that wasn't touching me, but also wasn't giving me space. My phone screen dimmed slowly, the message fading away. The moment it went dark, the room seemed to grow even heavier. Something shifted on the ceiling. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, steady movement, like fabric brushing across a floor. Except it was coming from straight above me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Finally, I whispered, "Why are you here?" The ceiling stopped moving. For a moment, it sounded like the room was holding its breath again. Then, a soft tapping came from overhead. One tap. Pause. Another tap. Like fingers drumming gently, deciding how to answer. A voice finally drifted down, calm, soft, almost thoughtful. You brought me back. A chill ran up my spine, but not the dramatic horror movie kind. More like when someone mentions your name from a room you thought was empty. I didn't bring anyone," I whispered. The ceiling responded with a quiet hum. Amused, maybe. Or just patient. You did. The warm air around me shifted, almost like something was circling slowly in the space above me. When you looked behind you. I swallowed, hard. That didn't make sense. I'd barely even turned around earlier. But maybe that was the point. I don't understand, I said. This time the voice came from a different part of the ceiling, closer to the door, as if it had moved while I blinked. You weren't supposed to notice me. My breath caught in my throat. The tapping resumed softly, like thinking. Most people don't. The room felt even smaller. I knew I shouldn't, but I asked anyway. What happens when someone does notice you? Silence. Long enough that I thought maybe it had gone. Maybe the warmth in the air would fade, and I could pretend none of this was real. Then, I stay. 2 simple words, soft, matter-of-fact, like it wasn't a threat, just a rule. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. For how long? The tapping stopped completely, and the answer came down in a single whisper, close enough that it felt like it brushed the air near my ear. Until you stop hearing me. The warm air faded, not gone, just drifting back. Then the voice added one more thing, almost gently. And you will, soon. The house that started to notice me back. After the whisper faded, the ceiling went quiet again. Not empty, just resting, like whatever lived in the shadows was content for now, patiently waiting for something I didn't understand yet. I stayed perfectly still for a long time, long enough that the warmth in the room drifted away, replaced by a cool stillness, the kind you feel in libraries or in the early morning before anyone wakes up. Eventually, I let out a slow breath. Just breathing normally again felt like a small victory. I glanced at the door. Nothing blocking it. Nothing waiting. Still, opening it felt like a risk. So I sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress soft beneath me, and quietly tried to think of what to do. The house felt different now. Not dangerous, but aware, as if its walls had been listening the entire time and were politely pretending they hadn't. I decided I needed to step outside my room, not to escape anything, just to see if the rest of the house still felt like mine. So I stood up slowly and reached for the doorknob. The moment my fingers touched it, the knob turned on its own. Gently, not pulling, not forcing, just turning the exact direction I was turning it, as if helping me. I froze. The door opened a few inches, letting a soft draft slip into the room. Nothing was in the hallway, just dim quiet and the faint hum of the house settling. I stepped out. Something subtle had changed. The hallway light was flickering earlier. I remembered that clearly. But now it glowed steady and warm, like it wanted to welcome me. That was new. The air smelled faintly different too, less dusty, more crisp, almost like the scent after gentle rain. I took a few steps into the hallway. The floor didn't creak this time. It always creaked, every night. But now it was silent, as if the wood was choosing not to make a sound. I whispered, "Okay." A soft exhale drifted from behind me. Not threatening, just a calm, slow breath, like the house was sighing in agreement. I turned slightly, glancing back toward my bedroom. Something small had changed there, too. The door, which I had left halfway open, was now fully open. Not wide, just enough to show the room was still dark inside, still quiet. But the shadows on the far wall had shifted, not dramatically, just subtly, like they were rearranging themselves to look more familiar, trying, maybe, to make the room seem normal again. I stepped further down the hallway. Each step felt smoother, as if the floor was guiding me instead of resisting. A soft creak sounded somewhere deeper in the house. Not alarming, just the usual nighttime sound, but slower, more measured, like it wasn't the house settling, but someone walking in the basement. I paused. The sound came again, a gentle creak, then silence. The house waited with me. For the first time, I didn't feel watched. I felt accompanied. Not by something trying to scare me, but by something trying to understand me, just as much as I was trying to understand it. A soft whisper drifted from the ceiling above the hallway, farther away than before, calm and distant. "You're hearing me less." My chest tightened, not in fear, just in quiet confusion. It continued, gentle as a breeze. "That means I'm almost done here." Then silence again. The house stood still, peaceful, listening. The house starts to remember. The basement voice faded, leaving a calm quiet that felt thoughtful. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. But something inside me said, "Keep going." I took a careful step toward the staircase that led down. Each footfall was soft, almost floating over the old wooden floor. No creaks, no complaints from the house, just steady guidance. The air grew cooler as I approached the stairs. Not chilling, just different. Like entering a place that had been waiting for me all along. I reached the top of the first step. The basement darkness stretched below me, thick but strangely calm. Not threatening, not wild, almost like a story waiting to be read. I whispered, "Hello?" My voice felt small against the quiet, but it carried in the stillness. A faint shimmer moved in the corner of the basement. Not a shape, not a shadow, just a soft, glimmering haze that pulsed gently. Slow, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Then I heard it again, a whisper, this time almost like words I could almost understand. "Memories, stories, lesson." I leaned closer, curiosity slowly overtaking fear. The darkness didn't push me back. It didn't threaten. It waited, patiently. Step by step, I descended. Each footfall placed carefully on the staircase, guided more by instinct than sight. When I reached the bottom, the basement wasn't empty. It was vast. A quiet cathedral of shadows. Dim light pooled in corners that had no source, revealing dust motes drifting slowly in the air. The walls seemed to hum faintly, as if the house itself was awakening, remembering its own history. I whispered, almost to myself, "What are you showing me?" The ceiling above the basement rippled lightly. The warm, gentle presence replied, calm and deliberate. The memories you forgot, the stories you ignored, the quiet moments that mattered. Soft glimmers of light drifted along the walls, like smoke but more tangible. They formed shapes, small fragments of rooms I remembered as a child. The staircase I had fallen on once, the corner where I lost a toy, even the spot where my cat had slept years ago. Every small memory was floating, alive and slightly shimmering. I realized then, the house wasn't haunting me. It wasn't punishing me. It was reflecting me, holding everything I had forgotten, showing me the quiet, small pieces of my life I hadn't noticed. I sat on the basement floor, letting the warmth from above settle over me. The shadows and glimmers danced slowly around the room. It wasn't scary. It was calm, even comforting in a strange, otherworldly way. The voice whispered one last time, "When you leave tonight, you will forget this house is alive. But the stories will remain, and someday you will remember." I nodded, even though no one could see me. I understood. I didn't need to remember everything now. The quiet presence, the glimmering shadows, the breathing house, it all felt like a pause, a soft exhale in a busy world. I rose slowly, climbed the stairs carefully, and returned to my bedroom. The shadows in the corner were still, silent, patient. The ceiling was calm, empty, resting. The house had done what it needed to do, and so had I. I slipped under the covers. The night felt lighter now, not empty, not haunted, just alive, and gently waiting. The morning it let me go. I woke to soft morning light spilling across my bedroom floor. The shadows in the corner had shifted just slightly, as if stretching after a long sleep. The ceiling was still. The warm, gentle presence that had guided me through the night was gone. Or maybe just resting, waiting for someone else to notice it someday. I sat up slowly, still feeling the echo of the basement. The house felt alive, not threatening, not watchful, just quietly breathing in time with me. My phone sat on the nightstand. No strange messages this time, no reminders of the whispering, no hint that the night had happened at all. Just the soft glow of a morning notification. Ordinary, calm, real. I walked through the house. The floorboards creaked faintly in the familiar rhythm I remembered. Not menacing, just home. For the first time in months, maybe years, the house felt like it belonged to me again. And I belonged to it. But not in the way anyone might imagine. Not trapped, not haunted, not scared. Just quietly connected. I remembered the glimmers in the basement, the tiny fragments of old memories, half-forgotten rooms, the toys, the cat, the stairs. They were still there somewhere, waiting for another night, another visitor, another quiet listener. And I knew I wouldn't forget everything, but some pieces would fade. That was okay. That was meant to be. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the soft light change as the morning grew brighter. The house was still. The air was still. And I felt, for the first time in a long while, a kind of quiet peace. I whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you." The room held its breath for a moment, then exhaled softly like it understood, not judging, not lingering, just acknowledging. I left my bedroom. I passed through the hallway. The front door opened easily. The light from outside poured in. The house was alive, but it also felt free, and so did I. I stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and ordinary, and yet, somehow, it carried the memory of everything that had happened. Not scary, not urgent, just quietly present. I turned back once. Through the window the house looked still, silent, patient. And maybe it was waiting, or maybe it was resting. Either way, I understood something important. Some presences aren't here to scare you. They're here to remind you that even in quiet, forgotten spaces, life, memories, echoes, small stories still exists. I walked down the street. The sun rose higher, and I felt, softly, a part of the house moving with me, in the warmth of memory, in the calm of understanding. Not as a shadow, not as a whisper, just a quiet presence, lingering behind the eyes, soft as a gentle exhale, and leaving me at peace. The house was alive, and so, in its own slow, quiet way, was I.